They struggled to breathe. With their mouths and nostrils caked with mud, the chicken coop, providing shelter and hope for survival, was only 20 feet away, but visibility was mere inches. While Francis Bender and his wife were able to open their eyes for only mere seconds at a time before being blinded with mud. They navigated by wind direction, but the wind must have changed because they found no shelter. They were now in a sprawling field with no hope for finding their way back. Suffocation was imminent. In the 1920s, the advent of tractor-pulled and self-propelled combines revolutionized crop harvesting across the American plains. These combines, however, were operated by farmers that didn't know much about the Great Plains. They utilized a farming technique known as deep plowing. Deep plowing plows the soil to a depth of greater than 20 inches. This mixes the soil, resulting in greater water retention over the years, and is a very beneficial practice in most cases. However, the deep plowing of the 1920s across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas removed deep-rooted grasses of the American plains. The deep-rooted grasses held water below the surface and could withstand long droughts and high winds. The droughts of the 1930s, paired with the lack of native deep-rooted grasses to bind the soil, led to the greatest economic disaster in American history. The Benders were a family in Monument, Kansas. They were typical plains farmers utilizing tractor and deep plow methods that left the farm dry with little to no yield, and they were nearly starving. Because of the drought and low crop production, they moved to livestock farming. They had some cattle, but most of their livelihood came from hens. Without the hens, they would be broke, unable to survive, and would be forced to give up their farm and move like many others at the time. Beginning in the summer of 1930, the droughts reduced the now unprotected soil to a friable dust. This fine powdery dust was susceptible to becoming unstuck to the ground during high winds. So much so that the next decade would be defined by the huge dust storms across the plains. With the Great Depression already causing havoc, the dust storms only aided in intensifying the economic downfall across the Midwest. People lost their crops, their animals, and their homes, and the Benders were on the verge of losing their farm as well. Between 1930 and 1940, approximately 3.5 million people left the plains in search of a sustainable life. On March 23, 1935, Francis Bender and his assistant farmhand were repairing a broken-down tractor on his farm near Monument, Kansas. The dust that was always blowing wreaked havoc on any machinery. The Benders' equipment was always in a state of repair, which gave them work because there were no crops to harvest. As Francis and the farmhand repaired the tractor, a shriek came from behind them. Francis turned to see his wife running toward him, pointing to the sky. He didn't need to look to know what was happening. He had already been in several storms, but none so far had been as deadly as this one. He turned and looked to the sky to confirm a huge black mass moving toward them. Saving themselves in this storm wouldn't matter if they didn't save their livestock. Mr. Blender commanded the farmhand to the shelter as he and Miss Blender sprinted toward the hens. They hurried to gather the hens and chase them to the coop, but the storm was approaching much faster than they had anticipated. Knowing this action could spell the end for their farm and potentially their own well-being, they abandoned the hens and ran for the chicken coop in search of shelter. But they were too late. The storm overtook them a mere 20 feet from safety. Instantly, their world turned black. What had been a clear day now had visibility of only a few inches. Dust to eat and dust to breathe and dust to drink. Dust in the beds and in the flour bin. On dishes and walls and windows, in hair and eyes and ears and teeth and throats. To say nothing of the heaped up accumulations on the floors and window sills after one of the bad days. As they held each other in blackness and were pounded by the rocks and dust in the air, they felt the wind change to the northwest. They used the wind to decide on a direction. They turned their backs to the oncoming wind and slowly shuffled in the direction of the hen house, so they thought. They slowly trudged through the dust storm, coughing and choking. When they counted approximately 20 feet, then 25, then 30, they had to accept that they had gone the wrong direction and had missed the coop. They recalibrated their direction and began again, but again they found nothing. And again they tried as mud caked the insides of their noses and mouths. They stumbled through the storm with eyes closed, suffocating, trying to find any sign of their location. It had only been a few minutes, and the blenders were already choking to death. They also knew that they had missed the chicken coop and had no sense of direction. Their next decision must be correct. If they went the right way, they would find the coop and be saved. If they went the wrong way, their bodies would be found shortly after the storm, somewhere in their sprawling 320-acre wheat field. They made a decision and began walking. After only a few short steps, they felt an object under their feet buried in the new layer of dirt. They dropped down to their hands and knees and pulled up a small piece of combine chain. All they had to do now was remember the last time that they changed that chain out in the field and then figure out the direction they must travel to get back to their house. But they couldn't. They sat in the dirt, frustrated, in silence. They realized that it was the soft cry of a terrified calf. It grew louder as they got closer. The calf had been in the corral before the storm. If they could reach the corral, they would have a landmark, and the configuration of the corral would give them a direction. As they approached the corral, the sound became louder and louder until it seemed as though every cow was screaming in terror. Before they reached the crying cattle, they were stopped by a barbed wire fence. They now knew that they were on the boundary of the corral, but still didn't know where. They followed the fence to a corner post, then continued on, still choking with zero visibility, until they felt a small mound under their feet. Again, they dropped down and dug into the new layer of dirt that was now piling higher and higher. They dug up a water hose. This hose ran from the corral to the windmill. There was a brick sidewalk spanning the distance between the windmill and their house. They relentlessly trudged through the wind-rocking dirt until they reached the house. Still, face to face with their own house, they couldn't see it. Visibility at this point was zero. It wasn't until they went inside that they found light. Inside the house, they saw a faint glow from 4 kerosene lamps illuminating the thick dust throughout. Mr. Blender's mother was frantically lighting the lamps in a vain attempt to lead her son and daughter-in-law back to the house. The family rode out the rest of the storm in the house with wet rags covering their nose and mouth to keep out the dust. 5 hours later, the storm ended. It was 11 o'clock at night, and the Blenders had no idea if their livestock had lived or died. Mr. Blender and the farmhand made their way through the darkness. Though the storm had passed, the air was still filled with dust, making the night pitch black. They made their way to the garage, still covering their nose and mouth with wet cloth. They entered the garage and luckily were able to start the car. They drove the car out to find the hens that were left out in the storm, with headlights illuminating only a few feet in front of them, until they finally found a tiny head poking out of the ground. In all, they were able to find 40 hens, all battered with broken wings and mud caked in their nostrils and beaks, and all barely alive with just their heads sticking up out of the new layer of dirt on the ground. After recovering the hens, the air was still so thick with dust that they missed the garage on the way back and had to turn around and search for it. The Blenders, though hurt economically, were able to keep their farm. This event was only a prelude to a 1,000-mile-wide dust storm that would occur 3 weeks later. That day would be called Black Sunday. The storm of Black Sunday would devastate the Midwest, wreaking havoc across the plains, and leading to the name, the Dust Bowl. Nothing that you see or hear or read will be likely to exaggerate the physical discomfort or material loss due to these storms. Less emphasis is usually given to the mental effect. The confusion of mind resulting from the overthrow of all plans for improvement or normal farm work, and the difficulty of making other plans even in a tentative way. Yet as we gray, lonely old people sit here by the fire tonight, planning for the year's work, my thoughts seem bound to fall into that pattern. It may be that the dust will choke us down. It may be we shall wake some happy morn and look again on fields of waving grain. This is True Mysteries. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.